They mocked it. Seward's folly, they called it, an absurd purchase of ice and nothingness, a frozen wasteland too wild to be useful. But buried under that tundra wasn't just snow. It was gold. It was copper. It was oil. It was a strategic prize so vast and so rich, it would power America's rise as a global superpower and become one of the most lopsided land deals in modern history. This is the story of a quiet treaty, a ridiculed purchase, and the treasure chest no one thought to open. Because what U.S. miners found in Alaska wasn't just wealth, it was a future. And the nation that sold it, they never said a word. They didn't have to. March 30th, 1867. The ink dried quietly on a treaty between two very different empires. Russia, financially strained after the Crimean War, had just sold a chunk of frozen wilderness to the United States, 586, 456 centered $12.2 million. That's roughly $150 million in today's money. The American public was bewildered. Congress grumbled. Newspapers roasted Secretary of State William H. Seward for blowing millions on what they called an icebox. One cartoon showed polar bears lounging under the U.S. flag. Another mocked a signpost in the middle of a blizzard that read, "Keep going Seward's folly this way." But the ridicule wasn't universal. Several major newspapers and members of Congress actually supported the purchase. Some saw the strategic logic of foothold in the Pacific, control of rich fisheries, a check against British expansion from Canada. Still, the loudest voices called it madness, and those are the ones history remembers. Seward himself believed Alaska could one day be America's gateway to Asia trade route, a naval outpost, maybe even a future state. The Russians, for their part, had calculated carefully. Supplying Alaska was a nightmare. The Russian-American company that managed the territory was bleeding money. Indigenous resistance, particularly from the Tlingit, was fierce. British naval power in the Pacific made the territory vulnerable, and the long supply lines from St. Petersburg made governance nearly impossible. Selling Alaska, they reasoned, was better than watching the British seize it for nothing. But there was something no one in that room discussed: the people who already lived there. Alaska was home to Tlingit, Haida, Yupik, Inupiat, Aleut, Athabascan, and other indigenous nations people who had inhabited the land for thousands of years. No one asked for their consent. No one included them in the negotiations. Their homeland was transferred between empires like a line item on a balance sheet. No parades, no triumph, just a quiet deal and a continent's worth of mystery sold over the heads of those who knew it best. For almost 2 decades, Alaska sat frozen in more ways than one. The U.S. barely touched it. There was no civilian government, no roadmap, no development plan. A skeleton military crew governed the territory loosely, sometimes brutally. Indigenous communities already disrupted by Russian colonization now faced a new and largely indifferent authority. What few settlements remained were Russian Orthodox missions, indigenous villages, and fur trading posts. The land was remote, harsh, and expensive to explore, but nature doesn't wait for governments. In 1880, that began to change. A local Tlingit chief named Cowie led 2 American prospectors, Richard Harris and Joe Juneau, into the mountains of southeast Alaska. It's worth pausing on that. Without Tlingit knowledge of the land, this discovery might never have happened. What they found would reshape Alaska's future: gold. Not veins buried deep in rock. Flakes and nuggets, lying in streams, waiting. A small mining camp turned into the city of Juneau. That gold rush didn't just put Alaska on the map, it signaled that the land wasn't barren. It was rich. But the rush also brought devastation. Miners flooded into indigenous territories, disrupting communities, spreading disease, and claiming land that had been inhabited for millennia. Suddenly, Washington was paying attention, but mostly to the gold. Congress passed the first Organic Act in 1884, officially making Alaska a U.S. civil district. With that came a court system, a governor, and the infrastructure to attract serious settlers. It was no longer Seward's folly. It was becoming America's last frontier, though for the people who had always lived there, it was becoming something else entirely. Summer, 1899. A sleepy Alaskan coastline, lit by the midnight sun, became the epicenter of a new American obsession: Nome. Miners discovered gold not buried deep in rock, but resting in beach sand. So rich, so shallow, that some used frying pans to scoop it up. Within weeks, the coastline turned into a city of tents. More than 10,000 men poured in from Seattle, San Francisco, and beyond. They came with dreams, shovels, and greed. Nome exploded. Saloon tents popped up faster than claims could be filed. Lawlessness followed. Shootouts, land disputes, theft. But the beach kept giving. By some accounts, stretches of sand were reportedly yielding up to $20 per ton, an astronomical figure for the time. People were literally digging fortunes out of the tide. For the indigenous Inupiaq communities near Nome, the rush was catastrophic, an overnight invasion of their homeland by thousands of outsiders who recognized no prior claim. And all of it was happening in a land Russia had once dismissed as a frozen liability. Some accounts suggest that when Russian officials learned of the Nome discovery, the reaction was quiet disbelief. No public statements, no official acknowledgement, just silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. Because the math was inescapable, they had sold gold-laced beaches for a fraction of what those beaches would yield in a single season. Gold opened the door, but the real fortune behind it was copper. Near the Kennecott Glacier, explorers found green streaks on the mountainside, high-grade copper ore, vivid against the rock. Some of the richest deposits ever discovered on Earth. In 1900, the Bonanza Mine was born, backed by titans like J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim family. The Kennecott Copper Corporation, the company name famously misspelled from the glacier it sat beside, grew into one of the most profitable mining operations in U.S. history. Between 1911 and 1938, approximately 4.6 million tons of ore were pulled from the mountain, yielding around 591,000 tons of pure copper and over 9 million ounces of silver worth, more than 200 million ounces of silver worth, more than $200 million at the time. To move it, they built the Copper River and Northwestern Railway, a steel marvel slicing through glacier fields and unstable permafrost. It was backbreaking, ice-covered, and deadly. Workers, many of them migrants and laborers with few protections, blasted through mountains and bridged canyons in conditions that would be unthinkable today. But it worked, and copper wasn't alone. Coal seams in the Matanuska Valley and Bering River region promised local energy for America's steamships, trains, and navy. Legal red tape and conservation battles slowed development, but the deposits were undeniable. Then came whispers of something deeper. Geologists started surveying, and what they found hinted at something massive, darker, heavier, and more valuable than anything yet pulled from Alaska's ground. Oil, 1698 Prudhoe Bay. A remote stretch of frozen coastline gave up its biggest secret, oil. And not just a little billions of barrels of it. It was the largest oil field ever found in North America. Suddenly, Alaska wasn't just a lucky investment. It was energy security. But there was a problem no one in Washington could ignore. Building a pipeline meant crossing land that indigenous Alaskans had never formally ceded. Their claims, unresolved for over a century now, stood directly in the path of America's energy ambitions. In 1971, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSEPA. It was the largest land claims settlement in U.S. history, 44 million acres and nearly $1 billion transferred to Alaska Native regional and village corporations. It was a milestone, though, an imperfect one. Many Native Alaskans felt the terms were imposed rather than negotiated, and the corporate structure it created remains debated to this day. But, with the legal path cleared, construction began on one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. 800 miles of pipe, running from the Arctic Ocean to the ice-free port of Valdez, through mountains, across earthquake zones, over permafrost. It finished in 1977. Oil surged south through steel. Since then, over 17 billion barrels have been pumped through that line. Revenue from oil transformed Alaska. Schools, roads, airports funded in part by resource royalties. And then came the Alaska Permanent Fund, a sovereign wealth fund that now holds over $70 billion. Each year, Alaskans receive a Dillion check, not because they struck oil, but because their land did. But prosperity came with a cost. In 1989, the tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound, spilling 11 million gallons of crude into pristine waters. It killed hundreds of thousands of seabirds, thousands of otters, and devastated coastal ecosystems and fishing communities for years. Alaska's oil wealth was real, but so was the price of extracting it. But Alaska's greatest value might not have come from below the ground but above it. In 1942, Japanese forces bombed Dutch Harbor and occupied two Aleutian islands, Attu and Kiska. Alaska became a battleground. The Aleut people paid the heaviest price. The U.S. government forcibly evacuated hundreds of Aleuts from their homes, relocating them to internment camps in southeast Alaska, where conditions were appalling. Dozens died. Meanwhile, the military scrambled to fortify the territory. Bases were built, radar stations erected. The Alaska Highway, a wartime engineering feat, linked the territory to the lower 48 for the first time by road. And when World War II ended, the Cold War began. Suddenly, Alaska was America's closest point to the Soviet Union, just 55 miles across the Bering Strait. Air Force bases in Anchorage and Fairbanks stood on constant alert. The distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations, stretching across the Arctic, scanned the skies for Soviet bombers. If World War III had started, Alaska would have been the front line. The territory that Russia once couldn't wait to unload was now the edge of a nuclear standoff. And the Russians? They now had missiles pointed at the very land they had signed away a century earlier. The irony needed no commentary. So what did $7.2 million actually buy? Start with the gold. By the mid-20th century, Alaska had produced over 30 million ounces worth, more than $60 billion at today's prices, and the mines kept producing. Then add the copper, nearly 600,000 tons of it, plus millions of ounces of silver, pulled from mountains the Russians never surveyed. Then came the oil, 17 billion barrels and counting, feeding a sovereign wealth fund that now dwarfs the GDPs of some nations. And that's before you count natural gas, rare earth minerals, timber, and some of the most productive fisheries on the planet. What the United States bought for the price of a modest Manhattan estate was a strategic, resource-rich empire stretching from temperate rainforest to Arctic ice. But tallying the profits alone tells an incomplete story. Alaska's wealth was extracted at a cost to the land, to the water, and above all to the indigenous peoples whose home it had always been. Their story doesn't fit neatly into a ledger. Russia didn't just lose land. They lost leverage, resources, and a seat at the table in the Pacific. Whether they regret it depends on who you ask and when. Today, the Arctic is heating up, literally and politically. As climate change melts polar ice at record speed, new shipping lanes are opening. Resource-rich seabeds that were once locked under permanent ice are becoming accessible, and the great powers are circling. Russia has been rearming its northern frontier, aggressively reopening Soviet-era bases, deploying new missile systems, and running military drills above the Arctic Circle. Moscow has filed claims with the United Nations for vast stretches of Arctic seabed, asserting rights to resources beneath international waters. China, despite being nowhere near the Arctic, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing heavily in polar shipping routes, icebreaker fleets, and mining partnerships with Arctic nations. And the United States? It's reinvesting in Alaska like it hasn't in decades. Military infrastructure is being modernized. Cold War-era radar installations are being reactivated. The Army is training new Arctic warfare units. And known once, a beach of gold is being eyed as a deep-water port for Arctic operations. The Pentagon now calls Alaska America's strategic anchor in the Arctic. The race that began with a quiet treaty in 1867 is entering a new chapter, and this time, the stakes aren't gold or copper, they're control of the top of the world. In 1867, Russia made a calculated choice. They sold a territory they couldn't defend, couldn't supply, and couldn't profit from. By the logic of the moment, it made sense. But history doesn't grade on the logic of the moment, because what they gave up wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a treasure chest of resources, geography, and global influence that no one had yet measured. They didn't know what was under the snow, but the United States kept digging. And what they found: gold, copper, oil, strategic dominance changed the trajectory of a nation. Russia has never publicly expressed regret over the sale. In official histories, the decision is treated as pragmatic, even wise for its time. But every barrel of oil pumped from Prudhoe Bay, every radar station scanning the Bering Strait, every dividend check mailed to an Alaskan household, these are quiet, compounding reminders of what once was. Russia owned Alaska. And then, for the price of a rounding error in today's federal budget, they let it go. What would you have done, sold or held? Drop your take in the comments. And if you love true stories where history, money, and power collide, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got more coming. Until next time, stay curious.